Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the Bramasol webcast series. Today, we are privileged to be with the Matthews team, Ed Brady and Rob Marsh from Matthews. And we're here as well with Paul Miller, who is, I think, one of the leading experts on in-house cash, particularly with SAP, but in-house cash in the world. So thank you all for joining. Today, we're going to talk about driving value from implementing in-house cash and treasury and give you a perspective from the actual people who have to use this and why they went ahead and did it. The first thing we'll talk about, just as a reminder, is that this session is being recorded, so you can ask questions throughout. I'm sorry, there's something going on the PC here. Hold on. All right, this webinar is being recorded, so I encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. You can download previous webinars from our homepage, so please feel free to go ahead and do that. We have numerous webinars and pieces of content that you can access. You can contact us, Bramasol, here at bramasol.com. You can go to the Resource Center, check out all of our great content, engage with us on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can also go to our YouTube channel where we have several dozen different videos, including customer-facing and customer demos, as well as Apple iTunes and iHeartRadio to download our podcasts and webcasts. The agenda of today is first, let me take a moment again to thank and welcome Rob. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us.
Thanks for having me.
And Ed Brady, head of the Global Shared Services team at Matthews. Rob is the treasurer there, the money man. Ed, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, for you, thanks.
Yeah, and Paul Miller, as I mentioned, senior treasury consultant at Bramasol and one of the leading experts in the world today on SAP and SAP in-house cash. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk a little bit about why are we here. We'll talk and ask Ed and Rob to tell us a little bit about Matthews. And, you know, I am really excited to have these guys on the line because I learned a lot when we went through the sales cycle. And I think you're going to really like to hear about them. They're a really awesome company. And it's one of the great privileges I have in this job is to learn so much about the companies who are out there and the wonderful people who do some amazing work. We'll then focus on really why did Matthews choose to focus on in-house cash / payment factory and some of the goals. We'll talk about why SAP and why Bramasol. We'll do the flash for some of those who are out there and are finance experts. You know what the flash is. It's not a guy from Marvel Comics. It is really the flash report. And we'll give you the flash results on what they are seeing. And I think you'll be really impressed with the near-term results. And then we'll ask Ed, Rob, and Paul to share their insights and advice on what they would give to others. So with that, why are we here today? Quickly, we all know what's going on in the world today with the new economy, the changing economy, the issues and challenges of the digital disruptions that are going on. And when I was doing research for this webinar and when we did on cash and banking earlier this week, I read about 25 different reports, and really what they focused on and told us is three things are what the CFOs and companies are focused on, particularly CFOs and treasurers. And of course, Rob, you can confirm that, but really focused on number one, liquidity, liquidity, liquidity. It's all about liquidity management and cash forecasting. We know that cash is king, and particularly in today's challenging environment, companies want to know where is their cash, how much cash do they have, are they taking advantage and using that cash, are they net borrowers versus net lenders, and how can I get a better position and focus on my cash management and leverage that better. Risk management. We talk a lot about supply chain resilience. Bramasol likes to say there's something called finance and supply chain resilience. And without a solid finance resilience program, it's very hard to have supply chain resilience. And we're going to do some upcoming events on that. And finally, security and maintaining internal controls in a remote work environment. And I know, Ed, that's a big topic for you as well as Rob. really being able to focus in on, now that many of my people are remote, and a lot of today's environment is in this remote environment, how do I make sure I'm maintaining not only the security of my transactions, but how am I maintaining the security of the interactions? How do I make sure that my remote workforce is enabled, and how do I create and maintain my internal controls? So with that, let me turn it over and see, talk, and Ed, maybe you can talk a little bit about Matthews and introduce everybody to the identity company that is Matthews.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, just a little bit of a background. Matthews is about $1.5 billion in turnover, global enterprise now, squarely in the mid-market. I guess you would characterize it similar to a mid-market manufacturing company. 3 broad segments that all have heritage back to our original value proposition that goes back 170 years or thereabouts. We were built probably scale-wise over the last 20 years or so via acquisition. We bought about 100 companies over that time. And what we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years is driving some integration of a lot of those so we can behave more like a global company rather than an assembly of the various businesses that we've purchased over the last 20, 25 years.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so like I said, we're global. We're doing business in maybe 25 or 26 countries at the moment. That's a lot of geographic scale for the size business that we are. And we're primarily in the revenues that we serve primarily in North America and Europe. So that's where most of our business is done. That's where most of our earnings come from. And we've been focusing in that space primarily.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Any comments to add, Rob? Thoughts?
Sure. Just maybe 2 of the things. You know, Ed mentioned that as $1.5 billion company, we're much more global than most people would realize. We're doing about $1 billion of revenues in the United States, where we historically have been most integrated. But then the other $500 million, as you see, is abroad. Probably the other thing that's worth noting is that an awful lot of our business proposition, particularly on the service side, is by leveraging labor in lower cost countries in order to service business that is executed and sold in more developed nations. So therefore, while you look at this on a revenue basis, what you don't see is the amount of intercompany activity, and particularly work that's being done in less developed areas, or what might be considered large but developing nations, places like India, China, Malaysia, Turkey, Russia, Costa Rica, and then sold into the US, Germany, UK, etc. And that aspect actually creates an awful lot of the pain that this helps solve.
Right. Perfect. And you know, one of the things, and as I mentioned, I think that's great. And I had no idea when we first did research on you guys. We first got together, it's almost a year ago now, and talked about this subject. And 2 of the great facts, and I encourage everybody on the line and anybody who doesn't know about Matthews to go check them out. You know, while they are known for and have had this memorialization business, it's really all about identity and identity management. And the 2 cool facts, and I always love to learn cool facts about companies, is your involvement in the UPC code and the creation of UPC codes and your leadership in that. And then a lot of that stemmed from your involvement in World War I and other areas around dog tags and things like that. So, you know, there's a lot of really great history behind Matthews, and there's certainly a lot of great things in the area of branding that you've done. And again, that expansion, as I looked at what your recent calls about your global expansion, drove a lot of these issues and challenges, I think, Rob and Ed, that you were going to talk about. So what I wanted to do, and this is really in the format of a conversation, and I wanted to ask Ed and Rob and Paul to share kind of the perspective here. So we want to start with, why was it, and we see some bullets on here, but why was it that you, as Matthews, focused on, and what were the specifics that you focused on, and why choose to do in-house cash? With a global business, you could have focused on risk management and exposures. You could have focused on foreign exchange. You could have focused on a lot of things. You chose and looked at in-house cash. Of course, you did do some FX, and we'll talk about that in another opportunity, but what was so big about in-house cash for you, Rob?
I'd say it's a good question for where to start, John. And I would say that for me, a lot of this journey started in two spots. One was seeing just how we have cash in so many different places around the world, touched by so many of our local businesses, historically largely operated on their own. And then marry that up with maybe two or 3 years ago, Ed invited me to go to a conference that where we could see the use of technology and how it was leveraging the ERP system that he was integrating around the world and try to develop and drive better activities. And saw that as an opportunity to really streamline the ways that we're doing things, streamline the way we're doing things differently, and frankly, get people's hands out of bank accounts so that we could simplify our business.
Right. And one of the things that you had talked about was that cash and how many people were touching it, how many bank accounts you had, and then the idea of this being a net borrower. Can you talk about that aspect for a second?
Sure. Ed mentioned that really over the last 20 years, we've grown largely through acquisition, culminated in 2014 with the acquisition of a formerly public company called Shock that was publicly traded, and then in 2015 by a privately owned business called Aurora Casket, really shoring up the two biggest parts of our business, but it also added to the complexity. And so as we did this, at one point in time, we had over 300 bank accounts around the world with close to 80 different banking institutions, and reported on internal months, so in between our fiscal quarter ends, cash that's probably double what we reported most recently. In our last quarter, we reported about $43 million of cash on hand. Mm-hmm. And so through that, realizing that, sure, we could have gone and implemented a TMS system and seen where cash was, but that would merely have identified the problem. It wouldn't really have solved the problem of trying to centralize where we're doing things and get better control on disbursements and the way we're sending money out the door.
Great. Okay. Ed, your goals were, in supporting, and I know as the shared services group, you support folks like Rob and others trying to drive this, but you had some other goals. You were looking at things like back office, and I love this term, back office bloat, and creating some behaviors and disciplines. Can you talk for a moment about the challenges you were looking at and kind of your goals as you set out on this journey?
Yeah, I think some of it goes back to the characteristics and the nature of the business. It's at least in my experience, a little bit unusual for a business our size, which isn't huge, to be scattered in so many different places and doing so much intercompany work with each other. And the fact that we didn't really do much to integrate these businesses leads a very bespoke looking back office. And so as we started looking at where can we get efficiencies from a cost structure standpoint, where can we get economies of scale, we really had to solve some of these processes at the root rather than just put a new TMS system on top of it and try to, spot solve for just some treasury things. So we were looking at a more holistic way at solutioning. We could use almost like as a forcing function to drive a step function improvement in our efficiency processing and process simplification, and use some things like the native functionality that comes in some of this FSCM solution set to basically use as a catalyst to drive to up our game and improve our fitness level in the back office.
Right. Yeah, and I think you had also mentioned, and maybe you can touch for a second on, the idea of, and as I looked at your last two earnings calls in the decks, I think this also prepared you because you're looking to continue that global expansion, correct?
Yeah, we're like growing into being a real like global enterprise.
Right.
And so the best we can do, I guess a probability of success will improve dramatically if we build that foundational underpinning that would allow us to bolt in the next acquisition or expand in adjacent markets without replicating on a local basis all the pieces that you need to actually keep the trains running.
Right. And the other, I think the other thing, Ed, you mentioned when we were preparing for this and talked was the idea of automation and how you thought automation would help free up resources and change focus on from, there's a famous chart out there that shows, moving the business from, spending most of the time, doing the reporting and not enough time on innovation to really focusing and driving automation to drive and drive down the amount of time you spend on the actual gathering of data and spend more time on that innovation piece. And I think I remember you mentioning something about that. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great part of a greater play where we've made a pretty substantial bet on SAP technology and deploying a single ERP instance worldwide. The next kind of natural adjacent areas to look at are in some of the finance and accounting and back office functions, and how we manage cash is certainly part of that. How many people we have touching cash is an internal control kind of a metric. Where the amount of intercompany work that we have, where FX risk accumulates on the balance sheet. If we can do a much more streamlined job of managing that, then our risk position improves dramatically, and coincident with cost structure improvement.
Great. Yeah. And that's particularly as we see this digital economy and the costs and the supply chain issues, you needed that flexibility and scale to do that. Sure. Paul, you and I and Kurt first met Matthews almost 12 months ago and got in there, and you had some interesting observations and you saw some things going on that you thought were great opportunities. Can you talk for a minute about your observations?
Oh, certainly. I was really impressed with Matthews in the beginning. They, first of all, we hit it off from the start. They were very open-minded. They're a very progressive company as far as treasury and getting their process streamlined. The big thing to me was they had already done an in-house cash project. I don't know if they thought of it that way, but in the U.S., they centralized their payables and their receivables, and they called that POBO and ROBO. And they did their process for ROBO centered around lockbox with their core lockbox banks, and they did their POBO through standard SAP functionality where they have one company code paying on behalf of the other. So they had their core processes in place, and they did a number of methodologies where when they do their pay on behalf or they receive on behalf, they used the SAP configuration where they automatically created an intercompany due to, due from. So it looked like, boy, it's a really busy place with a lot of intercompany, but behind the scenes, I'm kind of like smiling to myself saying, boy, they set it up the right way. It's perfect for us to go in there and leverage this and move it into in-house cash. Because really what in-house cash is, it's your internal bank, it's your settlement process, but it connects to all the other cash processes within the system, whether it's an outgoing payment or an incoming payment or bank transfers, that sort of thing. So when I saw that they figured it out, they knew how to do SAP, they had a single solution already, and really what they wanted someone to come in and help them just get the thing enabled, get it turned on. We didn't have to do a lot of work with change management because they already had the blueprint in the US, and all we have to do is roll that out to Europe. I was impressed with Matthews from the start with just the way that they had their SAP environment set up.
Yep. And I agree, and I think that's helped and we'll talk about some of the lessons when we get to the lessons learned. I think one of the big ones is the open-mindedness and the focus and attention that Rob and Ed paid to this. So, but why don't we jump over here? So, Ed and Rob, You mentioned focusing on SAP as the platform, and of course there are a lot of other TRM systems out there. I'm sure, Rob, you get calls every day from some of these companies. Why did you focus on SAP? What was it that you thought SAP could bring to you as an organization?
So this is Rob. I'll start answering that, but then I'll let Ed give you the right answer because he knows a lot more about SAP than I do. So I would say, first off, I was cautioned through working with other consultants on a couple of other things that if we use third-party software that then has to match up with SAP, then inevitably down the road, there's going to be an upgrade on one or the other of them. And the issue is, and we've all seen this with our smartphones, because these days we're all tech-enabled. But you see it on your phone where you have an app that you really loved and used all the time. Your phone upgraded, and the app's just a little bit behind. And now all of a sudden you can't use it for a couple of days. Well, that doesn't really work with cash within a global business. We can't wait a couple of days. And so the idea of having a blackout period because of technology is not very appetizing.
And how did you find the, and Ed, will jump over to you, but Ed, how did you find the features in SAP versus what a lot of people talk about in these other third-party solutions?
I would say our SAP journey, back to the SDK, the Shock acquisition, so it's pushing 5 years ago. That was the fork in the road decision for SAP. We looked at Oracle and SAP as finalists and made a strategic decision to basically put our entire business on one ERP back office. So we've been working on integrating our various businesses onto an SAP for the better part of the last 3 or 4 years.
Right. And what made you?
When it came time to look at how do we manage the in-house cash and improve our fitness around treasury, really it was around, does SAP do what we need it to do? Because all other things being equal, we'll just keep expanding the solution set that we've already committed to.
Okay. And you felt like SAP was going to be there. We see so many of these other solutions come and go. I'm sure that part of it had to do with the fact that SAP is investing a lot of money, time, and is going to be there for a long time. So
I would say when we started this a year ago, we didn't know SAP was going to be the right point solution for this space. But that's when SAP brought Bramasol to the table, and we started getting some engineers in the room and kicking the tires and coming up with something that would work. We saw a lot more benefit of the integration with what was already in SAP, rather than bolting something out to the side of it.
Okay. And how did Bramasol help you with that process?
We did a lot of solutioning skull sessions during the sales cycle. So we got down and dirty with how this was going to work, and we kind of convinced ourselves that the engineering was right before we ever launched the project and greenlighted it.
Okay. And you felt like, and we went through a lot of it, but Paul in particular and Kurt and the team, they brought the insights that you needed to the table to help you make those decisions?
Absolutely.
If I can add to that, yeah, that was kind of magical for me. Usually we come in and we're doing a sales session, but we came in and we stayed 2 days, and the second day they're saying, well, let's skip that. We'll do the paperwork and get the contract done. Let's start laying out what this blueprint and design is going to look like. And and I could tell these guys did their homework up front. Like I said earlier, they had their processes all lined up, but then they started asking the real detailed questions. And I think we went right into the following week or the week after that into basically mini blueprint workshops. So my recommendation and what we did here that I'll do every time going forward is don't be afraid to bring all the details forward early. They did their homework, we have to do ours. Make sure and we always do this anyway, we make sure that we know the customer's business, we know what their requirements are. We can't be afraid to tell them what's not possible either up front. We did a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of challenges from their side. Well, why can't we do that? And we had to do some homework. For guys, Kurt and I, who've been doing this for 30 years, they challenged us to go back and think about things we hadn't looked at in quite a while. but there's a lot of things that just came right out. We were able to get a really big jump start on this project and hit the ground running. We never slowed down since.
No, it's been great, and you guys have been helped me learn a lot. So, Paul, what is it? So, you mentioned you've been doing this for 30 years, and certainly SAP has evolved. Why do you think SAP/Bramasol, but this SAP solution is the right solution, and what do they bring to the table when you think about what you were doing? Why is SAP the right solution?
It's in real estate they say location, location, and location. In SAP, it's integration, integration, and integration. It's the connections between all the different processes and where they come together. And treasury, and when I say 30 years in treasury, my first 10 years were as a banker and as a practitioner. And this kind of fits into this answer. Treasury is integrated with the rest of the business. You need cash on both sides. You're paying the bills, you're collecting the bills, you got to get the funding, you got to swap it into the right currency, all that, et cetera. And so Treasury, in order to do their job, and I think the first question you asked Rob in the beginning was why in-house cash, why not treasury and risk, right? Or why not some of the other types of things you can do with treasury? Why do we have to start with in-house cash? Because we have to get all the basic transactions into the system. And that's what SAP gives us. They give us a way through in-house cash to bring payables and receivables into the system, be able to centralize that through the in-house cash module. And then once all the transaction processing is in, then we can start looking at our exposures. We can start doing the FX hedging that support our underlying business transactions. We can make sure that we have the funding in place and in the right currency, et cetera. So the big benefit of SAP that you can't get anywhere else is the integration. It's all in one spot. We could integrate with a Kyriba or another tool, but again, it's like Rob said earlier, over time, you have to keep the integration in sync, whereas in SAP, it's automatic.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but they come and go, Paul. I mean, you've been around long enough to have seen at least 5 to 10 different treasury, quote unquote, workstations. I come and go, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. What's also good about SAP is you can develop common processes. So we're talking about centralization in a GBS, a global service center, but we can run that distributed or in a shared service. We can, and in fact, we're kind of morphing from one to the other for Matthews, because they're as part of the in-house cash project, they're also moving to a shared service. So we didn't have to wait for Matthews necessarily to put an organization behind it. We could use it with the existing organization, but the system software itself is centralized. It's just how we roll it out to the people in the field. So we yep.
And I'd be interested, Ed and Rob, in your comments on that, as well as do dashboards and analytics, how does that play into some of that decision making? Well, we'll shoot for Ed first. Ed, any thoughts?
Well, I would say the sweet spot of the tool is to provide better intelligence to make those decisions. Some of these tools deployed as bespoke standalone solutions are pretty data dependent. So our play was if we could feed the data monster with what we're already doing within SAP, then we've solved for that. And then we can move on to a much more, I guess, higher order innovation. The analytics and the aggregated reporting on top of it, honestly, that's a bridge we haven't crossed yet. But I think we've set the Lego blocks in place where that's actually going to be a more trivial undertaking than if we were trying to build this thing from scratch.
Sure. Great. Rob, you're the guy who at the end of the day has to make these decisions, and the CFO comes to you and the CEO come to you and say, where's all my cash? Any thoughts or comments before we move to the next? All right. So, let's talk about the early returns here, the flash report. And why don't we'll start with Ed. Maybe you can talk about what you've seen from the perspective of creating a shared service, of creating a centralized organization and the focus on that. And then Rob, maybe you can tell people a little bit about, I was just blown away, by the way, by your comments on how much you've actually been able to reduce cash and increase efficiencies. So Ed?
Yeah, I would say the early returns are favorable. It's a little bit early in the journey, but we are running a pretty good cross-section of our in and outbound cash through the payment factory, what we're calling the payment factory now, through In-House Cash. I would say within our line of expectations, I mean, we clearly have a much more common process with much more structural integrity than we had in the past. We're seeing that, and we're seeing the dividends paid on that really every day. Another side benefit is it's basically forcing a level of discipline that we must have in order to run the payment factory, within our, tolerance of process control. But we didn't have that before. So it's really forcing us to up our game. And by and large, the organization has adopted to that new normal and are performing at a higher level. So it's kind of accelerated our culture shift. And Paul talked about, we could deploy this with or without a centralized organization. One of the things we said going in is, left on our own, the culture shift would happen on light year speed. But what we've been able to do in, probably roughly 6 months or so, is we've gotten to the point where we can almost seamlessly shift the delivery of that as a service to a regionally delivered shared service center without even upsetting the apple cart, which is a huge cultural thing for us. And I think that's one of the biggest early takeaways beyond the actual, quantifiable metrics, is actually forced our culture to shift much more radically than we thought we could do before, using this as kind of a forcing function project.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about that in some of the stuff about advice and thoughts, but also the speed with which you were able to make this transition. I think a lot of people out there have a vision that doing something like this takes forever, and I'm signing up for a decades-long project. And the reality here is you've achieved, and Rob will share some of the results, but you guys have achieved pretty amazing results in 6 months.
Yeah. And then there's a couple other, I think, juicy tidbits, and Rob can expand on them. The whole intercompany, and typically in a big global company, is a pain point. The fact that we're not that big in terms of scale means we're not that heavily resourced. So intercompany balance reconciliation becomes a real pain point. And being able to get at least enough critical mass running payments through the payment factory kind of forced us to up their game with intercompany and made that a much more trivial reconciliation than it was in the past. And that's happened really over the last 4 or 5 months, realistically. And that was probably a pleasant surprise that we're able to move the needle that much in that amount of time, just in terms of kind of what risk is on the intercompany balances.
Absolutely, yeah. So Rob, you're the numbers guy. Tell us more.
Rob had sent me a message that he was disconnected. He's trying to reconnect. I'm not sure if he's back yet. I think he's showing.
Let me see. I'll just look in here real quick. See if we
can.
I
think one more point then before Rob gets back, because he's got a lot of the metrics on the actual cash balances and all. The other takeaway, I think, when we didn't anticipate COVID coming around when we started this project, as I guess everybody has. But what it really did is that stress tested our agility as an organization. And what we've found is we're able to rely on some of these type of processes and the functionality we put in place with In-House Cash to be much more resilient, to be much more nimble than we could have ever hoped to in the past. And that's a dividend that you don't see until you're forced to deal with it. But that was a pleasant surprise from our perspective, that we can be that agile as an organization, still do some of the things things that we've done with cash balances and some things we've done to clean out intercompany balances, while literally everyone is working from home, while literally, the processes that were bespoke are now common. So that allowed us to be a much more responsive and agile in our back office.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and while we're waiting, Rob is trying to join. We've got him. We'll resend him the audio pin. I know he's logged on. Paul, maybe while we're waiting. There you
I
are.
actually got back on by dialing in. I have no idea what happened. It's the fun of working from home.
There you go. So Rob, we were talking a little bit about, Ed was sharing some of the organizational benefits about really, getting this done in 6 months, driving discipline, and then he hinted at some of the things that you would talk about, like the reductions in cash, and simplifying intercompany transactions, et cetera. Maybe you can share some of the insights with this audience.
Sure, and I'm happy to do that. So bear in mind that one of the things that we did before we started is we actually set up a single entity notional pool. So in many respects, we viewed that as having a single cash register with a bunch of different types of currency that we could use to pay bills. But it would also give us the benefit of already reducing some of our cash. We just weren't really putting it to work. So we had already enabled ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, to just about drop our cash balance by, call it 50% from what it was during an intermediate month. But this allowed us to really squeeze it out and be more efficient with it. And so what we've seen, and we have not fully implemented this yet, as you probably have already heard. We've only implemented across parts of Europe, but significant parts of Europe, but have yet to link it in with the United States or with Asia. And some of the things that we have seen is we've seen some of our vendor payments move something like 60%, 60, of our vendor payments have moved from being done locally with local banks into our centralized structure. So therefore, we've got better controls over it and better centralization. We've moved something like 7,000 payments out of our centralized disbursement. And we got rid of 600 transactions that were happening between these entities. Now, again, since we don't have Asia linked in and we don't have the US in, we're still processing some manual payments. So once we get a few months from now, we're going to see this convert even further. But that results in some direct savings, both because nobody needs to touch cash on both sides. Nobody needs to go and enter an invoice to be paid. No one needs to go and apply cash that's received and clear items. And nobody needs to go back and follow up with disputes. Instead, a lot of this can happen through our ERP system and through some direct contacts, which is a significantly better place to be.
Oh, sure. And has it contributed also, intercompany and reconciliations and cash settlements always slow the close? Do you think it's had a positive impact on an accelerating close?
I think we will see that. This will be the first real month that we're using our in-house cash to process some corporate payments, effectively repatriating cash back to our corporate headquarters. And we're seeing a good benefit out of that already to help us squeeze cash from where it was just a few weeks ago as we get ready for our fiscal year end here at the end of September. So I anticipate we're going to see a very good improvement on all of those fronts. But we still have more work to do. I mean, everyone knows that embarking on something like this is not a snap your fingers. It takes a lot of time to fully integrate it and fully implement it, and particularly get all of the various aspects from receiving cash centrally to dispersing cash centrally and applying it across the various entities properly.
Sure. That's great. Thank you, Rob. Paul, any you've been down in the dirt working on this. What's your perspective?
Well, I thought I could elaborate. We were talking earlier about how fast we went and how we were able to use the agile methodology. And I thought it might be helpful to explain a little bit how that worked and how we did our rollout, just to provide some better context, if that's okay.
Please do. No, go right ahead.
So I think what we did on this project, because we got such a good kickstart with the initial meetings, and we did a heck of a lot of planning up front. And then what we decided to do was we did a global blueprint, right? And we came up with a global template. And we started in about this time frame, about the end of September. And by the time we hit Christmas, we had sat down with Matthews and we gave them, we had all the documentation in, we got the requirements, we actually built the system, and we went through prototype workshops. And we refined exactly what the requirements were. We got them nailed, and we basically did our 3 core treasury processes. We did POBO, which is our pay on behalf. We did our ROBO, which is our receive on behalf. And then we just did our intercompany, which we're talking about now. There's lots of ways that intercompany can come into the system, but it all can be settled through in-house cash. So we took a big stab at those 3 processes, and I think we nailed it. But in order to roll out, we actually had what I think was a very aggressive plan, but I was supported by Ed and Rob, that we wanted to keep the gas on until somebody, cried uncle or fell off the bus and we had to slow down. Well, that never seemed to happen. We got people engaged, and what we did in our agile methodology basically is we started small. We made sure we had decent sized scope, but we started with Canada and Mexico, and then we moved on to some of the smaller European entities. And so we did a go live every month. We had a go live set for February, and then another one in April, May, and June. And actually, we were going to go with January, and we had enough agility in our methodology to slip the first one to February. And that wasn't our fault. That was the banks weren't ready to process payments for us. But we had Canada, Mexico done right first. We had POBO and ROBO set up, and we had some intercompany. The issue with intercompany is you can't do it. You don't have all the entities in play. So we could only have intercompany between Canadian entities. That was sort of why they started out as the lead, is one of the reasons too. But we started small and we built on our successes. And with every go live, people were feeling positive. They did their work. We had a methodology in place that everyone could follow, and it became iterative. So we went from our first sprint with Canada and Mexico to our second sprint with France, Netherlands, and Belgium. And then our third sprint, we did the UK. And then finally, the big sprint 4, where we did Sweden and Germany. And so at that point, at the end of June, we had, I want to say, we had 40, 50 legal entities in play at that point. But we had half the world in place. Asia, we have a small footprint. We'll be doing that next March. But the big chunk left is the US. But we were able to roll it out at that level. And when COVID hit, everyone knows we went remote. We didn't miss a beat because everyone knew the game plan. Everyone knew what their roles and responsibilities were. Yeah, we had some weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and there were people who had issues connecting. We figured that out pretty quick though, and everyone was able to roll with the punches. We had a very good organization, great teamwork, and a great project manager too to keep us, moving along. But I think the key to us was 2 things. One is having a great plan and getting that prototype done up front. And then another one, which a lot of people won't know because it's only technical, but for our 3 in-house cash processes, we simplified our approach in SAP, and we really melded it all into a single process. So whether we're doing a payment or a receipt or an intercompany, at the end of the day, it's always an intercompany that we're settling. So we have closer to a single process, believe it or not, with what we have in SAP. And that's one of the things that I think is unique to us at Bramasol and how we deliver in-house cash. But we'll be glad to talk to folks about that. Absolutely. So we were able to simplify our process. We had everything nailed up front, and then we developed the methodology to be able to roll it out in cycles.
Yeah, and this section, let's talk a little bit about the advice. And Ed, when we talked about the advice, we originally said, well, let's do lessons learned, and you said, well, that implies something negative. So we said, what advice? And one of the things I really, that Paul touched on here, Ed, is that concept of pedal to the metal. And you had some great thoughts on that. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? You talked about the ready, fire, aim approach in the agile. Maybe you can share,
Sure.
What advice would you give anybody else who wanted to go on this?
Yeah. Well, the agile approach is something that is a little bit foreign to SAP deployments. Definitely global templating, designed once, deployed many times. But we're maybe a little bit skeptical going at this thing in kind of with a waterfall, I'm sorry, with the agile analogy with sprints and that kind of stuff. But I don't think what you can't overlook is the change component. So most of the folks that were changing how they do business and upsetting their day-to-day are accountants by nature, which tend to be fairly black and white and fairly risk averse. And so we could have done a whole lot of analysis and a whole lot of testing and spent another year before we got the thing out of the garage. And both Rob and I are a little bit kind of ready, fire, aim as a mantra. And we're pretty comfortable figuring out the details as we go. But not everybody that we're trying to pull along with us was comfortable. So, setting out a scope that was actually manageable and figuring out the details as we went, there's a lot less risk and a lot fewer people jumping out the window ledge when the impact is smaller. And that itself, I think, generates some credibility. So the second sprint went cleaner than the first, and the third went better than the second. So you start just building some momentum, and the whole change, inertia factor starts being less of a burden and a hurdle to overcome the further on you go. And I attribute that a lot to the agile approach that this whole project kind of endorsed.
Okay. And you talked a bit, Ed, about in the beginning, two things. One was that idea of balancing the idea to create consensus versus prescription. And maybe you can talk about that. And then Rob, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about, you had mentioned making sure that you have a focus on the experts and bringing all the right people to the table.
Well, I would say we knew going in we had a lot of improvement to make in our processes. So we wanted to rely on an expert once we found one. So that almost lends you to default to a more prescriptive nature. Like, this is how we're going to do it, and there's not really an opt-in. You just have a high bar. If you need to opt out, make a case, and we'll talk about it. But it wasn't an option to opt in when you get around to it and you feel comfortable. That was just a strategy going in with the project. And I think maybe that's an outcome or a lesson learned from what we've done over the last 3 or 4 years with SAP deployments. We would never have got 120 legal entities onto a single SAP instance if we wound up, modifying our approach every time somebody stood up and said, I don't like the way this looks.
Sure. Rob, what about you? You talked a little bit about, making sure you had the right people at the table. What advice would you give others if they were to embark on this, on making sure they did that?
So it's a good point. I guess I'd put it in 2 areas. Number one, Ed was not afraid to bring resources to the table to make this happen. So we certainly could have tried to use independent consultants. We could have tried to do it internally rather than come to somebody like Paul and Bramasol or experts at putting this in place. So that's step one. Secondly is, even when it came to trying to get all the various internal people on board with doing that, it takes an awful lot of organization. And Ed found a person who's been wonderful, and she was dedicated nearly 100% of her time with just trying to manage this process. And that includes making sure that we set up sessions, that we set up materials that are available to everybody, and all sorts of coordination, collaboration, and communication to try to make that happen. And that was tremendously important, particularly because we executed this project knowing we were not going to be flying all over the world. And thank God we didn't, because then COVID hit and then nobody was flying. But we could continue moving it forward because of that involvement. And I'd say the last part, which was one where we probably stumbled a little bit with our first go live, but then we were able to recover pretty swiftly, which was that you probably noticed that none of the people here had CPA after their name. And so none of us were nearly as good at some of the accounting work, particularly SAP accounting with all the intercompany and clearing accounts and the complexity that goes with that. And so we were able to grab a couple people internally and try to drag them into the process, along with Paul's got tons of knowledge of having just stood this before, Paul and Kurt and and Srini and Tanvi. And so we were able to adapt and put some of those pieces in place, convince the various controllers around the world who were having some questions, but frankly, they just wanted some clear direction and to be told that this is exactly how you're going to do it. And then it was pretty easily adopted after that. And that really helped us make a lot of progress and really not miss a beat the way Paul described.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and Paul, we have only a couple of minutes left. Maybe you can share some of your perspective real quick.
Sure. I think that, what was that term that you used a minute ago, John? Where you, whether we make them do it or we convince them to do it. You had a great way of saying that.
Oh, consensus versus prescription. Yeah.
Consensus versus prescription. So what we wound up doing was prescription kind of on the slide, but we turned it into consensus, and we kept it open. But we were, every time we had something come back to us, we were able to demonstrate our way of doing it, and if they had a piece that was missing, we added it as a requirement, or if it wasn't necessary, we were able to show why and what a different process would work, and convince the team that, yeah, a standard process is the way to go. So we were flexible enough to change the prescription when we had to, but the people on the other side were willing to follow the prescription. So that comes with, I think, just with leadership at the top, and then having consultants who kind of been there, done that as they go through. It's not to get, you keep the gas on, you keep it moving, and when people throw up roadblocks, you just keep working. You just keep working to get to the bottom of that issue. There's always a good solution that'll work for everybody. And so we had a great team, I think.
I do.
Additional 2 cents.
Excellent. Well, everybody, we're at the top of the hour here, and I want to thank Rob and Ed. I know they are extremely busy. So guys, thank you so much for spending an hour of your time to share your story with us and with the audience. And then, Paul, as always, it's a pleasure to talk to and work with you. And we look forward to continuing to help Matthews on your successful finance journey. For those of you who are out there, just real quick, we do have a health check from Bramasol that we offer for Treasury, and we take experts like the ones you've heard and help you understand your opportunities to improve your Treasury solutions. We focus on 4 basic areas: accounting, functional, reporting, and technical. We do a 3-step process, and then finally at the end, we do this around whether it's Treasury, revenue accounting, or lease accounting, really give you the opportunity to understand how best to use SAP to solve your problems and make it better. So with that, again, I want to thank Ed, Paul, and everybody. Thank all of you who joined us, and I hope you get out there and make it a great day.